How's it going? Thank you to those of you that are in the room. A quick standard announcement. In case of a fire or something similar, like a lion, stay and get warm. No, actually, if there's a fire, if the fire alarm rings, you need to exit one of the fire exits. That's back where you came from. Out that way. Definitely not that way. That way is certain death. Please also put your mobile phones on airplane mode or off. And hello to those at home watching this or while driving or wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. It gives me great pleasure to welcome John Bowers back to SARC. I don't know, actually maybe in some ways he's never left. John is visiting, well, was technically visiting scholar, visiting professor at SARC over the course of the pandemic. He started just before the pandemic, and so a lot of his visiting was done remotely. It's great to actually have him back in the building. John intends to continue to be here to the end of time, and we're very grateful for that. So yeah, please welcome John, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you very much, Paul. Greetings, roomies, and people elsewhere, and people in the future who may wish to watch this. So I'm going to talk under the title of Ontologies of Displacement, which is a bit of a grand title and probably a mistake. But it was 3 months ago that I was asked to write an abstract, and it seemed a good idea at the time. And I thought, well, what can't be an ontology of displacement? So I'm sure wherever I'll be in 3 months' time, it will be okay. Well, let's see if it's okay. As always, I like to begin with this quote from Raymond Queneau. I think when I talked here last year, I also mentioned this quote. And he was one of the founders with François Le Lyonnais of the Workshop for Potential Literature, the Oulipo. He characterized the Oulipians, and obviously I could tell you all about them, but that would be another few days lecture. Oulipians are rats who build the labyrinth from which they try to escape. And I always like this idea of building a labyrinth from which you intend to escape, or at least try to escape. And I try and think, a lot of the intellectual and practical and artistic work I've done could kind of be thought of in this way. A labyrinth from which I suffer while I'm in there and really intend to escape sometime, but never quite manage it. And I guess it's in the trying and in the building that the art lies. So the outline today, I'm going to talk a little bit about computing and governmentality. I'll say a little bit about what I mean by that later on. I'm going to talk a bit about placement, emplacement, displacement, re-emplacement. I'm going to talk about Michel Foucault's concept of heterotopia. Simon, did you bring the photograph of, you couldn't find it. In a former life, I was head-shaved and didn't have the long white beard and used to wear black and white polo necks, and people were always mistaking me for Michel Foucault. But anyway. So I'll talk a bit about Foucault's concept of heterotopia and also some of Karen Barad's work on interaction. And this will sort of shape up a kind of perspective on some of my work, particularly work looking at archives and archival performance. And this was the topic of a talk I gave almost exactly a year ago. And it's still with me, and it has new twists this year. So a little bit about the idea of essaying as it emerged in ideas of the essay film and also in literature, and how, again, this is sort of all of these thoughts have configured some recent personal work. And I'll talk about one work in particular, which was the first live performance, live in the sense of being in front of co-present humans, that I performed this year after a nearly 2-year break. And then I'll also lead on to saying a little bit about The Sorting Box, which is the name I've given to the performance tomorrow. And I will end inconclusively with an inconclusion. And if I think this talk is going to suggest anything, I hope it suggests a kind of example of a particular kind of entangled practice of thinking, making, and performing, one that I inhabit and I'm ongoingly exploring. Yeah. But most of all, it's a big plug for tomorrow. And this is a publicity image that I've made. So 10 minutes past 1300 hours to 1400 hours o'clock p.m. in the afternoon tomorrow. I'll be doing this piece, which I'll say more about as well in the course of this talk. A year ago, together with Adam and Paul, musically, I performed a kind of live soundtrack, which we webcast to a piece, to a movie I made called Archivex. Now, this again, one way of thinking about the sorting boxes, some of my thinking a year on, and also some of this talk also kind of refines and develops some of the thinking which I described last year in the making of Archivex. Okay, so computing and governmentality. Now, I've worked in and around computing technology for a large amount of my life. As a youngster, I was programming biorhythm printouts with punch cards in the mainframe computer at the Ipswich Civic College. I've worked in computer science departments. I do a lot of work with programming languages, particularly pure data, and also image processing with processing, and that features a lot in my work. Many years ago, now nearly over 30 years ago, I was involved with the founding of a research field which had the rather ugly abbreviation CSCW, Computer Supported Cooperative Work. I founded the European Conference series of that and was joint editor for a journal, and then withdrew from that when I couldn't do the work. And done a lot of work in human-computer interaction research and also designerly approaches to that. So I've had a long-term engagement with computing technology, which has been a long-term struggle. And a long-term struggle with a lot of ideologies of computing, a lot of ideologies of technology, and a lot of the rationalities which are attached to computing, and a long-term struggle with with a whole number of ideas from user-centered to design to the metaverse, all of which are deeply problematic in my view. And one way into this that has also been with me for quite some time is to think about the history of computing, partly from a media archaeological point of view, but also from a careful historiographic point of view. And in particular, over the years, I've been influenced by Martin Campbell Kelly and his various books on the history of computing. And I do recommend them to you. He's an elderly gentleman now, but he's still with us and still active, thinking about the history of computing. And one thing his work and the work of other scholars like him brings out are, of course, the close historical and practical ties between computing and governmentality. And I mean governmentality, a little bit touched by Foucault here, in an extended sense. The practice of government, whether that also is government by the state, or the government of the self by the self, or some other rationality. The ties of computing to governmentality have always been interesting to me, and something which, as I say, I looked to Campbell Kelly's work to give a historical elucidation of. And of course, as is well known, many of the early histories of computing are tied to questions of government, and in particular, to spend a few moments talking about Herman Hollerith. And as many of you might well know, Hollerith devised the idea of the punch card. He devised the punch card. And in the Hollerith machine, which was implemented as part of the 1890 US Census, the Hollerith machine was able to compute and analyze the 1890 census within 6 years, whereas the 1880 census was only analyzed within 8 years, only 2 years to go before the next one was due. And so with the massive explosion of population in the US, it was clear that another form of computation was required other than manual counting and sorting and so on to actually get a result before the next census was due. And Hollerith is most well known for the invention of the punch card, which in his machines, quite interestingly, they were like filaments, electrically conductive filaments went across the top of the punch card and dropped through where there was a hole, and then connected with a bath of mercury underneath to create an electrical connection. And here's some examples of Hollerith's patent, a page from Hollerith's patent on the left-hand side, one of his punch cards, and also the Hollerith machine with, at its side, the sorting box. And there's another view, the sorting box in a different version at the side of the Hollerith machine there on the right. And I rather like this idea of there being a sorting box. And so the cards are placed across the top of the machine, across the top of the box. The machine is programmed to make certain kinds of selections based on what's being typed into the punch card, and then they're sorted below. And this has served me in some ways as it's given me the title for the performance tomorrow. But the idea of a sorting box, I think, is kind of interesting. And just make a few sort of remarks about what we see in this image, actually. They're obvious remarks. They're obvious remarks. But in this image, we see calculation, sorting and calculation, as having a place, a particular place. In fact, it has tabulating room written on the door. There's a particular place, and there's particular places and sites, loci, if you will, within this room where computation takes place, where tabulation, calculation, computation, sorting takes place. And Bruno Latour, quite a long time ago now, wrote in his book Science in Action about centers of calculation, again pointing to the idea that calculation doesn't just happen everywhere. There are particular places, particular centers where calculation occurs. And there are paths into those centers, which are paths of re-representation. So there might be the wild world outside, but that gets represented and re-represented, and in the case of the Hollerith machine, ultimately within a census-taking device, yielding a punch card, which is then taken to the center of calculation. So there are determinate places at which calculation occurs: the tabulating room, the sorting box, the voting machine, and so on. And this kind of, and these centers and the fact of centering calculation goes hand in hand with certain forms of governmentality. And I guess the kind of suspicion that I mentioned here, the suspicion that computation retains ties to certain forms of governmentality, and whether, even as some kind of fantasy, or aesthetically informed fantasy, we could inform alternative ways of positioning computation. These are things which I think are worth exploring. So, can we imagine other calculation places, or other strategies for emplacement, if you will? And this gave rise to my question a few months ago: what might an ontology of displacement or re-emplacement look like? And I give a little citation at the bottom here, a paper I wrote way back 30 years ago, The Politics of Formalism. And this was, when I was heavily under the spell of Bruno Latour. I really was in those days. I'm now less, much less. But that's a kind of work, an early work through, actually, of some of the ways of thinking politically with some of the, early for me, work through of some of the ways of thinking politically from this kind of perspective. So, one kind of writer who I think is interesting in terms of, and this is actually a little bit of an untypical piece of his, Michel Foucault. Now, obviously, we know Foucault from his archaeologies and genealogies of institutions, and also his genealogies of how of the self and the cultivation of the self that occupied him in the later volumes of the History of Sexuality. But in 1967, he wrote a piece which he delivered as a talk for a group of architects in Paris. And this piece was only published right at the end of his life in 1984, with his permission. And it is a piece which I think is worth a look. It's a speculative piece. It's the sort of piece that a clever person probably wrote in one setting, fueled by some strong coffee, just when he had to give the talk, and a few minutes later. It has that kind of character. It's called Of Other Spaces, and I have a quote here. And he sets himself the idea of how one might think about, categorize, if you will, different kinds of spaces, different kinds of sites, in terms of the sets of relations by which a site can be defined. And he works through some sort of obvious examples which would make sense to architects and geographers to this day. The sets of relations that define sites of transportation, for example, streets, trains. One could describe the cluster of relations that allows them to be defined, the types of temporary relaxation, cafes, cinemas, beaches. Likewise, one could describe via a network of relations the closed or semi-closed sites of rest, the house, the bedroom, the bed, etc. But among all of these sites, I'm interested in certain ones that have the curious property of being in relation with all the other sites, but in such a way as to suspect, neutralize, or invent the set of relations that they happen to designate, mirror, or reflect. These spaces, as it were, which are linked with all of the others, which, however, contradict all the other sites, are of two main types. First, there are the utopias. Utopias are sites with no real place. They are sites that have a general relation of direct or inverted analogy with the real space of society. They present society itself in a perfected form, or else society turned upside down. But in any case, these utopias are fundamentally unreal spaces. Now he introduces the concept of a heterotopia. There are also, probably in every culture, in every civilization, real places, places that do exist and that are formed in the very founding of society, which are something like counter sites, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. Places, there's a typo there, places of this kind are outside of all places, even though it may be possible to indicate their location in reality. Because these places are absolutely different from all the sites that they reflect and speak about, I shall call them, by way of contrast to utopias, heterotopias. Now, I guess you can tell from this passage, there's a lot of tension in what he's writing here. There's a lot of things which, if you were of a certain kind of uncharitable rationality, you'd say are quite self-contradictory about what he's written. He's clearly trying to set up some alternative in our thinking about places beyond the everyday, which characterized beaches and all of the rest. He's clearly wanting to set up some kind of contrast to utopias. And a background for a lot of French writers that I think it's important to remember throughout the 60s and 70s is that there's often a tacit contest with the orthodoxy of the French Communist Party. And that's very much going on here. There's a wish to think other than the utopia of a possible communist society where this is already being undone in terms of the state violence of the Soviet Union, which people, of course, are now were well aware of. But others were still producing apologies for. So Foucault's very much wanting to work with, thinking about some kind of real space, some place which is with us, but also has this kind of curious referentiality to a whole set of other spaces. And this, I think, is an interesting idea. Warts and all, I think it's an interesting idea. And I think it's something which one could well rethink a number of the spaces and places, maybe the one we're sitting in, rethink a number of the spaces and places we're familiar with from this perspective. Foucault goes on to list six principles for heterotopia. And I'm just going to mention the third one. The heterotopia is capable of juxtaposing in a single real place, several spaces, several sites that are in themselves incompatible. Thus it is that the theatre brings onto the rectangle of the stage, one after the other, a whole series of places that are foreign to one another. Thus it is that the cinema is a very odd rectangular room at the end of which, on a two-dimensional screen, one sees the projection of a three-dimensional space. But perhaps the oldest example of these heterotopias that take the form of contradictory sites is the garden. We must not forget that in the Orient, the garden, an astonishing creation that is now 1,000 years old, had very deep and seemingly superimposed meanings. The traditional garden of the Persians was a sacred space that was supposed to bring together inside its rectangle 4 parts representing the 4 parts of the world, with a space still more sacred than the others that were like an umbilicus, the navel of the world at its center. The basin and water fountain were there. And all the vegetation of the garden was supposed to come together in this space, in this sort of microcosm. As for carpets, they were originally reproductions of gardens. The garden is a rug onto which the whole world comes to enact its symbolic perfection, and the rug is a sort of garden that can move across space. The garden is the smallest parcel of the world, and then it is the totality of the world. The garden has been a sort of happy, universalizing heterotopia since the beginnings of antiquity. Our modern zoological gardens spring from that source. Apologies for reading this all out, but I rather like this passage. I think it has, and again, also if you know the work of Foucault, there's a kind of approachability to this passage, which is a little bit different from his austere sadomasochism of his text elsewhere, particularly in the writings about institutions and punishment. And there's a kind of invitation here to think, albeit maybe on the pains of difficulty and potential contradiction, about heterotopias that we might find or might wish to make, and treating the garden as a place where whatever else is not the garden can become present in the garden is, I think, a kind of an appealing idea. Now, I don't know whether, actually, I don't know enough about the history of rugs to know whether he's right about the origins of rugs in horticulture and so on. But it's a nice idea. Now, but alongside Foucault, I want to just talk a little bit about some of Karen Barad's work. And because I think Karen Barad, of contemporary thinkers that I've sort of recently engaged with, provides some useful, I think, adjustments to the perspectives that certainly influenced me from people like Michel Foucault. And also, for that matter, I mentioned also some of the social studies of science and technology work of people like Bruno Latour. To me, Barad offers a more subtle and supple approach to a lot of philosophical ontological questions in the sciences, both in the human sciences and the social sciences as well. And she draws a lot on a particular reading of Niels Bohr's work, Niels Bohr's interpretations of quantum physics. And this leads her to some interesting perspectives. So I'll just highlight a few things here. The very nature of materiality is an entanglement. Matter itself is always open to, or rather entangled with, the other. The intra-actively emergent parts of phenomena are co-constituted. And this is a core part of Barad's thinking. First, this neologism of intra-active. So she's contrasting here intra-active with interactive. And typically when we think about things being interactive, we often think about there being two preformed entities that come into relationship. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I have a kind of history in human-computer interaction. And a lot of the thinking there, and there's textbook diagrams showing stick figures and computers and arcs between them. I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of thing. And those diagrams perform a very interesting separation, an ontological separation of two things, and then a problematization of having done that separation, what are the relationships? And then human-computer interaction as a sort of subdiscipline within computer science comes into existence legitimated by diagrams of that sort as the means to provide answers to the question of how two separated things could be brought together. And that's the kind of problematic of interactivity for Barad, that there's an ontological separation which problematizes a gap or a series of relations which we then solve, we then mend in some way. But she wants to look at things differently, and as I say, this is a view that is very much inspired by her reading of Niels Bohr's reading of quantum physics experiments. That rather than there being the things that are separate, there are things which intra-actively co-constitute each other. So their separations are achieved. So the separations of things are at least as achieved as the things themselves in these complex patterns of relationship. And this leads to, I think, a kind of interesting ontology, an interesting dynamic ontology, where things can emerge, where things can be achieved, reconfigured, configured and reconfigured. And this passage, which I won't read out, is in full. It gives some examples of how far she's prepared to put this point. And she's prepared to put this point towards a particular ethics of accountability for how we create separations and for how we formulate our ontologies and what relationalities we create. Again, I have a quote here where she, again, some very clear, some clear statements here. Concise statements. Individuals do not pre-exist their interactions. Rather, individuals emerge through and as part of their entangled interrelating. And this is not to say, and this is important, that emergence happens once and for all as an event or as a process that takes place according to some external measure of space and time, but rather time and space, like matter and meaning, come into existence, are iteratively reconfigured through each intra-action, thereby making it impossible to differentiate in any absolute sense between creation and renewal, beginning and returning, continuity and discontinuity, here and there, past and future. So I've mentioned that this arises from Barad's interpretation of quantum physics, and as you may know from classic experiments in quantum physics, matter shows itself as wave-like or particle-like, depending on experimental conditions, depending on the forms that the apparatus takes, the kinds of measurements that are made, how the experimental setting is framed and segmented from the rest of the world. And for Barad, these experimental arrangements are not so much the means to an end, the means for the production of knowledge. They co-produce the knowledge. They co-create, co-constitute the phenomena. And this perspective I've found very appealing, and also provides for me, as I say, a kind of a dynamic to certain kinds of social scientific theoretical positions. Okay. Now, I want to connect this, and this is speculative on my part, and this is very much in progress. I want to connect these kinds of thoughts to some of the kind of archival turn that I've been making in a lot of my creative practice. And this is a recap from something from last year, when I talked here last year. And this is a little compendium of a lot of talks I've done, and shows my enduring love of Gil Sans bold. I really ought to get over that, I think. But anyway, and I've made a lot of stuff over the years. I've done a lot of things which are little makes of certain kinds. The things I make tend to be either labyrinthine pieces of code in pure data or processing, or shanty-like physical constructions. There isn't much of a midway for me. There's either, labyrinthine code which I pore over for hours, or there's a bowl of components that I throw some electrodes into. There's not so much of a midway, nothing that would be a new instrument for musical expression or anything in between. But there's a lot of stuff, and very much a kind of theme of my kind of talk last year was, well, when you've done a lot of stuff, how do you make sense of it? How, what do you do with your lot of stuff? Do you just leave it as a bag of stuff? Or do you work on it in some way? And this, in some ways, is like my own personal archive. And I guess I have a personal archive which is more out of these projects, these makings, these fragments, archives of recorded material, rather than archives of CD releases or albums or things like that. This is my archive has this kind of form. And what should I do with it? How should I think about it? And when you have a studio which looks like this is actually in my old house. In my new place, it's even worse. Again, what sense can be made of the mess? And so I began to think about, what value might there be in thinking about your mess, the things one makes as an archive, as a personal archive. And back in 2004, Hal Foster wrote a very influential article called An Archival Impulse. And what Foster had in mind was the archival impulse in the visual arts. And he distinguished three kind of archival turns that, this wasn't an exhaustive mapping of the territory. This was just three particular tendencies. The archive as capitalist garbage bucket. The archive as failed futuristic vision. The archive as partially buried woodshed, which is a reference to a work by an American artist I can't remember at the moment. It's about found work and revisiting found things, a partially buried woodshed as a source of artistic and archival meditation. And there's also, these are a couple of quotes from Foster. A final comment on the will to connect what cannot be connected in archival art. And this is one of Foster's phrases. He regards the archival impulse as a desire that many artists experience to connect what cannot be connected. This is not a will to totalize so much as a will to relate, to probe a misplaced past, to collate its different signs, sometimes pragmatically, sometimes paradistically, to ascertain what might remain for the present. It assumes anomic fragmentation, lawless fragmentation. Quick translation of anomic there for people without a classical education. It assumes an anomic fragmentation as a condition not only to represent, but to work through, and proposes new orders of effective association, however partial and provisional, to this end, even as it also registers the difficulty, at times the absurdity of doing so. So this will to relate, to connect what cannot be connected. And in my own work, and this dates, again, going back sort of nearly 10 years now to work that I did while working with Bill Gaver at Goldsmiths College in London, where I worked as part of a design department. A very different context in many ways. But we worked on an idea of annotation, the idea of kind of charting the similarities and differences in a corpus of work, and charting them in a particular way to speak to research issues that concerned us. But again, analyzing similarities and differences in a corpus of work. and this, combined with thinking about the essay format and the essay film, last year brought me to Archivex. And this was a film made last year, a 50-minute film, something like that, which went through various episodes and which Adam, Paul, and I improvised a soundtrack to. And the film itself was made up of 6 parts, which were given these didn't appear as captions, but they were given as in the title sequence of the film. Transduction, ask not what is in the machine, but what the machine is in. Ruined temple, soup, love hours, and escape mechanism. I'm not going to say about what all of these mean, but they were annotations of my personal archive. They were things that I'd worked through in terms of the things that I'd made, and here given a more abstract and sometimes a slightly sort of poetic resonance as kind of 6 annotations that worked on my personal archive. So there are things that I do which are about transduction, which are about taking one form of matter and energy and making it into another. There are things which problematize the machine. There are things which are heretical, which are about ruining temples. There are things which are soup, just a whole bunch of stuff put together. Love hours, actually I am saying what each of these were. Love hours is, these are things of absolutely crushing sentimentality. Right? And there are things which perhaps offer an escape mechanism. I don't know. Okay, so this year, and just the remainder of the talk is going to be a little bit of a review of things I've done over the last few months and a big plug for tomorrow. So my further work this year, what I want to try and do, or I'm in the process of trying to do, is to imagine a kind of heterotopia for archival work. Something which has a kind of, Baradian sense of intra-activity to it, rather than, a Foucauldian discipline. Although I think that particular Foucault piece is quite warm and cuddly anyway, well, at least for him. And to do this to inform performance, but particularly improvised performance with music, film, and text, working with archival materials, and along the way to explore alternative strategies for positioning computation technologies and the rest. So the kind of first outing for thinking along these terms was a performance at the Spill Festival, a performance art festival, which is every year in my hometown of Ipswich. Ipswich born, Ipswich bred, long in the arm, thick in the head, as they say. And this performance was called Memory Grinder Resonance Machine, written as one word, took place in this building, the building on the left here, which is an old maltings by the dockside in Ipswich. And the performance was based around sound recordings, photographs, film, other material, texts I wrote, collected from 4 sites around the town, which had some personal significance, but personal significance which also enabled some cultural springboarding into some cultural and political and historical springboarding into other issues. And it took the form of, an 8-channel sound installation. I'll show you some stills from this shortly. A spoken word episode, and then a transition into a second space where I improvised with a sound performance with 4 films projected on the walls of on the inner walls of this building. This is actually now, after years of failed redevelopment, with no venture capitalist willing to speculate on this building, it's now been acquired cheaply by the local council. who are going to make it into a climbing wall, a massive climbing wall. Should be good. Should be lethal. I have some stills from this. Actually, part of the contractual agreement with the festival is they have the only filming rights, I'm afraid, and recording rights. But sometime I hope to be able to show you at least some of those. And so these are some still photographs of the inside of that building, illuminated for health and safety reasons, but also where I cited 8 small, tiny little loudspeakers with SD cards in them, playing recordings which related to the sites that I'd investigated. And on the left, you see me declaiming a text, which I won't read from now because I haven't got so much time. But again, I'm happy to talk about what the nature of that text was, a spoken word piece, which kind of linked the sound installation from the performance. And then in the second half of the show, I improvised with my synthesizers and sound recordings, and again, using some room feedback techniques, which I will also work with in the sorting box and describe shortly. You see in this picture atop an extended microphone stand a bronze head who is a kind of DIY binaural head, picking up room feedback. And just to give, again, an indication of some of the materials I worked with, some archival photographs. This is of a pub, the Albion Mills, which is now built over with a Skoda dealership. It was demolished in 1996, but was the site of legendary performances by Extreme Noise Terror, early days of grindcore, and lots of performances by myself. And again, I took photographs of the site, and particular of traces of drains and pipe work, which is still on the pavement. And part of the spoken text was to construct a fantasy fiction of how the buried cellar of the Albion Mills is inhabited by amphibious creatures in the dark, hybridized between the rats that used to occupy the cellar and the DNA of stray punks, and that they are plotting their return down the sewage pipes to take over the town. And so there was this kind of nonsense. And also the films I made in part used a technique which I will focus on a lot actually in the performance tomorrow, which is of algorithmically generating layered collages from photographic material and archives. And here's some stills. The two on the left refer to a demolished house in Ipswich, which was actually at one time occupied by people who were related to those who owned the maltings. And it was a place where I played as a child in its ruins. And I returned to the site, which is now built over with luxury homes, and broke into a few edge spaces and found bricks from the old building and things like that, which I mic'd up. And on the right, these are collages and layerings made up of paintings by John Moore of Ipswich, who in his day was quite a well-known local artist. I mean, his work isn't as psychedelic as this. It's psychedelic when it's in my programs, though. I actually now own 4 John Moore of Ipswich paintings since then. I've become quite an enthusiast for his work. My top tip, he's going to be collectible. And these refer to the docks where the performance was, and also to a particular site of the docks where an incident, a historical incident, I did again incorporate it into the spoken word text. Okay. So the sorting box takes, which is tomorrow's work, takes some of these sort of ideas and techniques further. So again, this is made of field recordings, pre-composed fragments, studio improvisations, particularly from the last year. And I'm going to be working with a live archive of 32 sound files. And I'll say a little bit about what happens to these sound files and has happened to them shortly. There will be 5 films made using photographs as raw material, layered and animated using the techniques that I've shown stills of. And there'll be an improvised performance with the films projected. And I'll be working with my modular synthesizer. I'll also be analyzing the live sound and using the live sound as it emerges to shape the sound file selection. So the archival material will be shaped by the live sound. And room feedback techniques will also be in place to connect all of this to the space, but also, and I suppose it's maybe timely that I should make a little tribute to Alvin Lucier, of course, recently died. I was always very struck by his text, which he reads in I Am Sitting in a Room, where he talks about one of the points of the work is to smooth irregularities that his voice might have. I think that's the very phrase he uses. And this idea that you might have complex interactions between a room and sound within a room, which, if you iterate it, has an interestingly emergent smoothing, so that somehow out of material plus a room, you create a new substance, a new kind of smoothed substance. And again, this is an idea that interests me quite a bit. So again, in some ways, conceiving of the Sonic Lab as a sorting box for live archival textures. And some of the things I'm going to be working with, including the room feedback techniques. This is actually a thing from last year's talk, which I've again sort of been working on and made even more complicated. A series of feedback networks where things being listened to in the room pass through multiple forms of parallel analysis and processing, and then are mixed back and put back into the room. So the idea of this, and I spoke about this last year, so I won't say much more now, is to kind of, in a way, have a system which has in microcosm Discipio, in microcosm Collins, in microcosm a lot of other kind of feedback effects, but actually explores their superimposition and their layering and their so playing with multiple sort of feedback techniques at the same time. And then brand new for this year is some of the archival analysis work I've been doing. So this started off with 30 sound files, and each was reduced by time contraction to a 30-second thumbnail. I mean, some of these files are like really long, meandering improvisations, which I make no apology, you know, like 30, 40 minutes, you know. And some are shorter, you know, some are merely 25. But so thumbnails were made of each of these, and then an index file was made by chaining all of these together. And then this was analyzed using a technique called non-negative matrix factorization, which I won't go into detail, but it enables you to extract a certain number of features or bases from any given sound material. And you can specify how many bases you want. So if you want the technique to just make some kind of very crude spectral binary between 2 different kinds of spectral information, you set it up to find 2 bases. So I set it up to find 4 bases. I've worked with this technique to find 8 and more before, but 4 bases here. And then the individual sound files are then run again to see how they match the analyses of the whole archive. And a classification system is derived associating with each sound file the presence, absence of a preponderance of interaction with respect to each basis. So basically, the whole archive is put through this analysis, and then individual items are then reanalyzed to see how they relate to that whole archive in a second iteration. So then an index, these set of analyzed files, together with the index file itself, which has a lot of concatenations, and a layering of all 30 together as a generic noise, archival noise, are put together to make 32. Okay, and then live sound, which can be me playing my modular, room feedback, whatever, is then analyzed with respect to the 4 bases that the same analysis has taken place on the archive. And then that is used to select candidates from the archive. And then those candidates are loaded into a mixer for manual manipulation. So the idea is that we have this archive of sound files. There's listening in the room, algorithmic listening in the room. Sound file, a selection of the sound files is made. We noodle around with them. That's listened to in the room. And then when the moment is right, we get more sound files, which are right. And the most related and the most unrelated sounds to ongoing activity are, but they appear as candidates. So you're not in this world of to those who have will yet more be given. You know, there's the possibility for tension and contradiction there. This is just a screenshot from Flucoma, the work at the University of Huddersfield, which I've been working with. And this shows what the results of the analysis of the index file looks like. 4 bases are extracted. These are on the left there. These are spectra. These show levels of spectral activity. You see basis 0. There's lots of bass there. Basis 3 is low mids. Basis 1 has a spread, but still sort of contrasting with basis 2, which is a kind of noise residue. So there's like lots of activation across the whole spectrum there. And then the activation levels show how much each of these bases is represented in the index file. And then the interesting thing about the NMF technique is you can then use the bases and match the bases with live sound to see how much live sound relates to these, and then use that as that's what I'm saying. So that's the kind of technique, the new technique for tomorrow. There's lots of stuff tomorrow, hopefully. Improvised performance, films projected. Yeah, if you like improvisation, do come. If you like films, do come. If you like modular synthesizers, do come. If you like how live sound can be analyzed to shape sound, yeah, okay. Okay, so to finish. In conclusion, I've talked about how the history of computing and its ties with governmentality, and I've kind of entertained the idea of trying to think, and this is on a long arc, I haven't really had time or really quite done the thinking yet to rejoin, but how ideas of place and computing and governmentality might be sort of twisted, worked with, via Foucault's idea of heterotopia, Barad's interaction, derived a kind of framework from this for thinking about archives and archival performance, described a couple of recent, a past work and tomorrow's work to a degree. A big plug for the sorting box tomorrow. But my hope is that in this I've given a kind of hint about how a certain kind of entangled practice can emerge, a practice which involves some thinking about stuff, some making, some performing. So that's it. Speculative, provisional, so I invite resonances, remarks, reactions, and corrections. Thank you very much. Oh, that's Pedro, isn't it?
Making heterotopias and how much at play is, I don't know, physical science context. So it occurred to me the description of the Ipswich versus tomorrow's performance is rather different in the sense that there's all the individual cultural resonances that you allude to, physical as well, down to the resonances of the space, cultural resonances. In contrast to the one here that seemed more material and procedural driven.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's a coincidence or if that's and obviously this you didn't grow up here, but this space also has some resonances for you over from over the years. So
there was a long time where I felt I'd never done a good performance here.
Right.
A long time. A long time when I felt I'd really struggled doing things here. And I suppose part of the struggle I had was that it wasn't the Albion Mill cellar, right? There weren't rats running around. It didn't smell of piss, and it didn't. It wasn't a claustrophobic environment where I could make a loud noise and get away with it. I guess that is a point. That is a point. And I suppose I don't know. This is sort of like speculative riffing, really. But I suppose there is that each time I've been here more lately, I have had a sort of different personal sort of response to the trouble of this environment. And I showed. I think I showed. There was a thing I did here a while ago as part of the humanizing algorithmic listening network, which I think was actually okay. And so what I'm hoping is tomorrow will be a little bit better than okay, but we'll see. But again, absolutely. And I suppose it's an interesting question as to just how heterotopic, utopic, or another concept hall is this space, and how we think about that. And in a way, I think tomorrow I don't want to over talk this. I've over talked things enough to this, but I do kind of want to see if it's possible for me to sort of make to do a kind of heterotopic appropriation of this space somehow with my mush somehow.
But it is a conscious change in your design approach.
Yeah. I mean, the problematic of this space is so different from the problematic of the maltings in Ipswich, right? And the maltings in Ipswich, because I'm, a good dark psychogeographer in my spare time. Obviously I thought, right, how many people died here? What happened here? Is this built on an ancient burial ground? Is that I think I went all into that completely. The people who owned Paul and White's, the people who owned the building, who were they? Where did they live? What did they do? And I found out that one of my close friends, actually, his father worked in that building for 35 years, and I had his on the table where I was performing. I had his sports club tie and a memorial glass that was given to him, not a memorial, a retirement gift that was given to him when he retired. So I was able to have some very specific artifacts present, materials present. One of the other sites was a recreation ground where I played with somebody when I was young. And this fellow went on to be a chemist, an electrochemist, and was killed in a laboratory accident researching cold fusion, room temperature fusion, in 1992. And if you remember room temperature fusion. You know, there was a big sort of controversy about whether it was possible to have nuclear fusion at room temperature. And there's still people who believe it is possible and others who don't, but it's very much passed out of existence as a current scientific topic. But in a period in the 90s, it was really controversial, and my best friend from primary school was one of the researchers on this, and he died in a laboratory explosion. And again, I made part of the piece out of that. So there's none of that tomorrow. So in some, I guess in some ways, tomorrow is more like, well, if this place has caused me trouble, and also is not so redolent with personal associations as another environment, what other kinds of heterotopic activity can I do here? And we'll see how it turns out.
I think that's a really interesting question, though. In absence of the cultural and historical materials, are these processes that you're engaging with the material in which you're creating these kind of interactions? There's definitely the room acoustics that you're playing with here, and probably with the other space. But we've talked a lot recently, and in fact we had a paper for the RHA, which is thinking about the virtual as material. Yeah. And I'm wondering if what's the material in which you're working on, or working with, or intertwined with, in this piece for tomorrow, or is that giving too much away?
Is it bones of your previous failed performances?
Or a nutritious stock made from
Ontologies of Disappointment.
Yeah. Oh, so good. What a good run at the moment. One thing we were doing in that paper with it was a film as well with Adam, was ensuring an extended appreciation for what counts as materiality, and again there's a phrasing of Karen Barad, but of others. Donna Haraway uses this phrase as well. Matter is what matters, and that mattering, making a difference, that engenders matter. So matter lies in the relationships of what matters, I think so. So one way of answering you is to draw attention to just again to the lists of stuff. There are 32 sound files. There's there's a condensation of a year's archival practice. There'll be lots of layered photographs and with a psychedelic tinge to them on a number of screens. There will also be just what I and others make of that, actually. In the real time of it happening. I really don't know how that will turn out. We haven't experimented with the space yet. There's a lot of that to do, and that will be part of the mattering as well. How things are deployed. I guess people. Yeah, so it'll be, I don't think it will be a kind of stagey performance. I think it will be, we'll try and sort of arrange things around. So again, giving an environment that can be, if not explored, then at least, sort of viewed in different ways. Yeah. Sorry, is this an answer to your question?
I think particularly that early bit of defining matter and what matters in those terms, expanding what the material is that you are engaging with. That it's not just this distinction between the physical and these sort of digital processes is kind of collapsed.
Yeah, I've never been a fan of that sort of nonsense. I think it's kind of interesting.
there's an old piece by Bruno Latour where he asks why is it that critics of relativism or critics of idealism and other forms of those kinds of philosophical positions, why is it that they always kick things, or bang tables, Johnson kicks a stone to refute Bishop Berkeley, Thus I refute Bishop Berkeley, This table, stupid relativists. People, that's the sort of thing people do. They perform acts of, attempted and failed acts of physical violence to refute relativism. Right? And Latour makes the rather interesting, kind of funny remark, about this, is that, well, actually, no, it's not a funny remark. It's the kind of, it's an insight, really, is that what those things are is they're displays of resistance. So if when you punched the table or put your fist on the table, it vaporized or something, or seeing the gesture coming, the table disappeared, or whatever. Or you would then have a kind of a different account of what was going on, or you might, and if stones felt elusive to a foot, or a foot was not bruised, or whatever, you'd have a different kind. So it's in the resistance. That matter emerges as well, and thinking of things. Now, again, I think those kinds of remarks of Latour about matter and resistance and res meaning a thing. It's in kind of Latin, res, resistance. Things are what resist you. But again, I think again, Barad has a more, a more thoroughgoing relationalism about matter than that particular Latour view. But anyway,
I had two related questions, if that's okay. I really like the quote that you mentioned to start with: "Rats who build a labyrinth from which they try to escape."
Quinoa, yeah.
Upon reflecting on your past work, do you feel as though you've built a labyrinth of sorts, and by archiving it, is that you looking to, not to necessarily escape it, but to move on from it onto new things? And related to that, what form will your archiving activities take in the future? Are you looking to simply archive what we've done to this point and cease archiving, or what does the future hold?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
it's very interesting. I guess I regard the kind of Quinault point, and also, applying it as well to my own sort of archive as a little bit of therapy. You have all of this messy shit. You've done loads of stuff. Some of it's made it into academic papers. Some of it's, some of it, but you massively underachieve in terms of releasing recordings and things like that. You don't even have a proper website, but you have a whole load of nonsense, and it's okay. and it's okay. And I think that's kind of a little bit how. And so you have this labyrinth. You're making it worse and worse, more and more stuff, but it's okay. And I find that kind of that Quinault remark very therapeutic in that regard. And I think when I sort of started thinking about I showed you some pictures of my studio, my studio at home, and there's a great phrase in Francis Bacon, where you're familiar with Francis Bacon's studio, which is like loads of stuff everywhere on the wall. There's some famous photographs. Of course, it's reconstructed now in Dublin, and Bacon collected large numbers of paper cuttings and photographs and so on, particularly from things like Picture Post, pictorial newspaper, news weeklies and so on. And they'd just lie around, and they'd fall on the floor, and they'd just be all over the place, And there was no sense ever about Bacon that he would ever tidy his studio, you know, or anything like that. And there's a great phrase where he referred to the floor potage. And you can imagine actually Francis, you know, sort of saying this with his sweet voice, you know. I found it on the floor potage. And you know, it's a pottage, it's a soup, it's a bundle of stuff, right? And so all of these things he was collecting, they get subject to their own mashings, you know, as he walks across them, you know. And a lot of the you know, the famous lacerations of faces and so on, and blurrings and marks that are, you know, in the human form that we associate with his paintings, can be found literally in a photograph that was, you know, stomped on multiple times and found on the floor potage. And again, I think, you know, I mean, obviously there's quite a lot about Francis Bacon's life which isn't reassuring. But you know, to find out that he had a floor potage and that was okay, you know, I find that reassuring as well. So I think compared with, sorry, this is where you asked me a kind of personal question, so it's okay to answer in this way. Compared to how I was there a couple of years ago, I'm much more happy with about being, you know, a really untidy person, and who's you know, going to keep doing stuff and find, you know, other labyrinths to make and carry on, really.
Well, we're well over time, but since we're all just still sitting here, if there's any final questions, we could probably have one more question, or we can leave it there. Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you. Hopefully see you tomorrow.
Yes.
Hopefully see you tomorrow.
Yes, hopefully.